Chapter 3 of Broken Plea opens with something that sounds dry: discovery. But in this chapter, discovery is the problem. Hi, my name is Stina. Welcome back to Motive and Method. If you're new here, I look at true crime through a communication and narrative analysis lens. So I'm not just asking, what does the official story say? I'm asking how that story got built, what became central, what stayed in the background, and where did uncertainty maybe get smoothed into something cleaner than the record actually supports. This is my Chapter 3 breakdown of Broken Plea. And just like with Chapters 1 and 2, this is not going to be a book report. I'm not going to sit here and read the chapter back to you. I'm going to summarize the main ideas in my own words, use brief quotes or references only when the exact wording matters, and then analyze the patterns I see through my own lens. Sound good? And Chapter 3 is loaded, because this is where the book moves out of the early scene, the early reports, and all the early witness accounts, and into the evidence universe behind the case. And right away, the pattern that stands out to me is this: the official story was not created from a lack of evidence. It was created from a selection of evidence. Keep that in mind. And when a case ends in a plea, that selection may never be fully tested in open court. That's what makes this chapter so important. Not because discovery is exciting on its own, because it usually is not, but because discovery is where you start to see who had access, who had organization, who had leverage, and who had the ability to shape the version of the case that eventually became the story. So, if you're ready to get started, Section 1 is buried in evidence. When discovery becomes a flood, access does not automatically mean usable access. So Chapter 3 begins with a problem that sounds procedural, but it's actually huge: discovery. And not just what evidence existed. The bigger question is, how was that evidence organized? When was it turned over? Who could realistically review it? And which pieces were pulled out of that massive pile and turned into the public story? Because on paper, a discovery dump can look fair. The defense got the material, as required by law. The evidence was technically disclosed. The boxes were checked. But that does not automatically mean the defense had usable access. Because if the material is massive, late, mislabeled, scattered across hard drives, and buried inside thousands of tips, files, searches, records, images, and leads, then the volume itself becomes part of the problem. At that point, the question is not just, did the defense receive evidence? The question is, could they realistically use it? And that's the first major framing point I see in this chapter. Was the defense given evidence, or were they buried in it? And I want to be careful here, because I'm not framing this as Ann Taylor failed or the defense didn't do enough. Honestly, the point may be the opposite. The question is whether any defense team could realistically process this much material in time, especially in a death penalty level case with massive discovery, intense public pressure, and a public narrative that was already deeply entrenched. Because the state has organized power, agencies, labs, experts, investigators, secrecy rules, timing control, narrative control. So the defense may receive discovery, technically, but if that discovery arrives in a form that is massive, disorganized, mislabeled, or difficult to meaningfully review, then access is not the same thing as understanding. And keep in mind also that she was a public defender for this case, so they do not have the amount of money for experts and everything like that as the state has. And also the state, as the author makes clear, the state has to hand over or to reveal all the information they have on the suspect, but there is no requirement, and I did not know this actually until this book, there is no requirement that they put that in order or when they need to deliver it necessarily. So when evidence is massive, late, mislabeled, or disorganized, the question is not only what was disclosed, but whether it could realistically be reviewed, understood, and challenged. And that distinction matters because when we get to the change of plea hearing, the story seems to narrow back down to the cleanest, most familiar anchors of the case: the sheet, the cell phone location material, the alleged vehicle sightings. So the plea hearing did not really appear to expand the story at all. It formalized the story the public had already been given. But Chapter 3 suggests there was a much larger evidence universe behind that story. And some of that material may have complicated it, weakened it, or at least raised questions that never had to be answered in open court because there was no trial. And that connects directly to the pattern I've been tracking throughout this series. A legally sufficient narrative is not always the same thing as a coherent narrative. A plea does not have to explain everything. It only has to present enough for legal sufficiency. But if the plea narrative is built from the cleanest pieces of the case, while the messier interior evidence stays largely outside public testing, then I think we have to ask which evidence became the story and which evidence stayed buried in the files. That to me is the larger pattern here. Evidence abundance can create narrative scarcity. There may have been a massive amount of material behind this case, but the public-facing plea narrative narrowed down to a few familiar anchors. That does not automatically make the narrative false, of course, but it does mean the narrative was selective. And because there was no trial, the selection itself was never fully tested at all. Once the physical scene is gone, the record becomes the scene. This is where Chapter 3 gets really important to me. Whitcomb describes a Seagate drive that was turned over to prosecution forensic expert Barbara Sutton. And this does not sound like just some random evidence folder either. It sounds like a concentrated digital version of the entire case. Crime scene imagery, autopsy photographs, surveillance video, drone recordings, social media images, selfies, screenshots from phones and devices. Basically, the digital universe of the investigation. Whitcomb describes it almost like the blueprint of the case, the spine of the investigation. And I think that word is important. Spine means structure. It means architecture. It means that this was not just a pile of files. This was part of how the case itself was being organized and understood. But then there's a detail that changes how I think about Sutton's review. By the time she personally examined 1122 King Road in December of 2023, the physical contents and the bloodstaining had already been removed. So she was not walking into the original scene in its original condition. She was working from the preserved record of the scene. And I want to be careful here, too. That does not mean her analysis was invalid. Forensic experts work from photographs, documentation, measurements, and records all the time. There's nothing really essentially wrong with that. But it does mean in this case the analysis depends heavily on the quality of the record. What was captured? What was missed? What was labeled clearly? What was included? What was made available? And what context came with it? This connects directly to the pattern I've been tracking since chapter 1, the gap between the scene and the story. Only now, it is not just body cam versus report. It is the physical crime scene versus the digital case file. Sutton had the blueprint, but by the time she walked through the house herself, the original physical scene was no longer intact. So the question becomes, how much can be reconstructed from the record? And how much depends on the completeness, labeling, organization, and quality of that record? Because by this point, the scene had become a file. And once the scene becomes a file, the organization of that file starts to shape the story. That does not have to be sinister to matter. That's just how documentation works. A photo can preserve something, but it can also crop something out. A label can clarify something, but it can also steer how that thing is understood. A file structure can organize evidence, but it can also determine what gets found easily, what gets buried, and what gets treated as central. So then, when we talk about the evidence in this case, we are not only talking about the physical scene anymore. We are talking about records of the scene. And records are not neutral. They are constructed. They are selected. They are organized. And once the original scene is gone, those records become the version of the scene that everyone else has to work from. That, to me, is the real issue here. Not that the file is automatically wrong, but that the file becomes powerful. Sutton entered the case after Kohberger had already been charged, meaning her analysis began inside an existing prosecution frame. Whitcomb then gives us the scale of Sutton's report, and it is not small. Thousands of crime scene photographs, autopsy photographs, body cam video, images connected to Kohberger. So again, we are dealing with a huge amount of material. But then Whitcomb makes an important point. Even this report was only a small sampling of the entire file. And that matters, because we are still not looking at the whole case, which is arguably very frustrating. We are looking through a selected window, and that selected window gives us a glimpse into what the prosecution had access to before the plea, and what the defense may or may not have had the time, organization, resources, or ability to fully process and challenge. And then Whitcomb shifts into confirmation bias. And to me, that is not random. He is telling us how to read what comes next. Because by the time Sutton was hired, Kohberger had already been arrested and charged. By the time her report was filed, trial was already set. So the question is not simply, was Sutton qualified? And it's not even, did her report have value? The deeper question is, did this analysis begin inside a theory that had already hardened? And also, I want to be careful here. I don't read Whitcomb as saying Sutton set out to be biased or that her work should be dismissed. That's not the point. The point is structural. When an expert is brought in after the arrest, after the charges, and after the prosecution's theory has already taken shape, the analysis may begin inside the frame the state has already chosen. When a theory already exists, later analysis may begin by testing how evidence fits the theory, rather than asking whether the theory itself is complete. This is also where I would not frame the issue as bias versus no bias, because none of us is walking around completely bias-free. That's not how humans work. The real question is what kind of frame the evidence is being analyzed inside. Are we asking open questions, or are we asking how the evidence supports the theory that already exists? Because those are not the same thing, unfortunately. And this is where people outside the courtroom process may actually see something differently. We are not locked into proving one side's theory. We can step back and ask, does the evidence build the story? Or is the story organizing the evidence? That, to me, is the question underneath this entire section. Then Whitcomb starts with the house itself. And at first, this might sound basic. He goes over the bedrooms, the floors, the front entrance, the sliding glass door, Xana's room, the kitchen, the living area as well, and the stairs. But this is not just background. In this case, the layout is the narrative. The route through the house is the theory. The entrance and exit points are not just architectural details. They are part of how the prosecution's story works. In this case, the layout of the house is not background detail. It shapes the timeline, movement, entry point, exit point, and theory of the crime. So, before we even get to bloodstains, crime scene interpretation, or expert conclusions, Chapter 3 is asking us to slow down and look at the map. Because if the map is incomplete, selectively emphasized, or built around assumptions that were already in place, then the story built on top of that map may inherit those same problems. And that's where the house stops being just a location. It becomes the logic of the case. So, the public story can make the scene feel fixed, but the physical evidence may suggest movement, force, and repositioning. This is where Chapter 3 moves from the layout of the house into the physical scene itself. And this is where the pattern gets much more serious. Whitcomb starts with the accepted route. The sliding glass door was open. There were no signs of forced entry. And most people have accepted the sliding glass door as the likely entry and exit point. But he also keeps one unresolved detail alive: whether the front door was open too, which he mentioned in Chapter 2. And that matters because this is one of those places where the story starts from what seems most likely. The sliding glass door makes sense as the route, but likely is not the same thing as fully resolved. So already we have a likely route, but not a fully closed question. Then Whitcomb makes a major shift. He moves from sudden summary to what the photographs appear to show. And that matters because this has been one of the patterns from the beginning of this book. The difference between the summary layer and the raw layer. This section focuses heavily on the third floor scene, especially Maddie's room. And I'm going to handle this carefully because the details are graphic, and the point is not to be sensational. The point is whether the physical evidence matches the scale and sequence of the public story. One issue Whitcomb raises is body position. Sutton's observations appear to suggest that Kaylee's posture or position may have changed during the event. And that matters because the position where someone is found may not fully explain where the blood evidence was created. That does not mean we jump to a theory. It means we slow down. The position where a victim is found may not be the same position they were in when blood evidence was created. And I also want to be precise here. The important distinction is not necessarily that Kaylee was moving around the room after the injuries. Sutton's point appears more limited. The blood patterns may suggest her posture or position changed during the event. So the scene where she was found may not be a perfect snapshot of where and how the blood evidence was deposited. And also this could suggest staging. I think Whitcomb is suggesting here as well. Then there is the unidentified hair issue, which I hadn't heard at all until this book. And this is one of those details where we have to be careful. An unidentified hair does not automatically mean an unidentified assailant. Houses have transfer evidence. Bedrooms have visitors. Hair moves in ordinary ways. So the question is not, what does this prove? The better question is, if a hair appeared unusual, darker, shorter, and possibly associated with blood, why does the analysis seem to move past it? Because unexplained does not mean proof, but unexplained evidence still deserves to be accounted for. Whitcomb also gets into bloodstains, cast off and impact spatter stains near the door casing, and other blood evidence that may suggest a more violent and dynamic event than the simplified public narrative conveys. And again, I'm not bringing this up to dwell on graphic detail. I'm bringing it up because the physical evidence matters to the structure of the story. If the spatter patterns, cast off, and impact staining suggest an unusually forceful event, then that matters when we compare it to the witness statement, the sound evidence, the timing, and the idea of one person moving quickly and quietly through the house. Then there is a precision issue. Sutton reportedly refers to spatter on the underside of a shelf above the headboard, and Whitcomb notes that Maddie's bed did not have a headboard. Now, on its own, that may sound small. And to be clear, a wording issue like that does not automatically invalidate an entire report. But in forensic reconstruction, scene language matters. If a report refers to a headboard that apparently did not exist, that raises a precision question. And in a case where the physical scene is already being reconstructed through photographs and records, precision is not a luxury. It is the foundation. When the scene is reconstructed through records, even small descriptive errors can affect how the evidence is understood. Then Whitcomb connects the physical evidence to Dylan's account. And this is where the narrative question becomes harder to avoid. Because if third floor scene involved this much force, movement, and blood evidence, then Dylan's reported experience inside the house becomes part of the evidentiary puzzle. Not because she needs to be blamed, and not because she needs to be excused, but because her account helps shape how the sequence is understood. The question is not simply, what did she hear? The question is how the physical reality of that scene fits with what was later reported, what was not reported, and how those details became part of the official story. And that, to me, is the deeper problem. The official story often feels linear, but the scene described here does not feel linear. It feels dynamic. It moves. It shifts. It leaves traces that do not fit neatly into a clean sequence. So the question is not whether the scene was violent. Obviously it was. The question, however, is whether the violence described by the evidence matches the story built around it. Now Whitcomb moves into Dylan Mortensen's first formal statement. And I want to emphasize that phrase, first formal statement, because this is not necessarily the cleaned up version most people absorb later through the PCA, media summaries, or the public narrative. This is an early account, and it reads like an early account. It is fragmented. It is sensory. It has approximations, fear, tiredness, uncertainty, and the feeling of someone trying to reconstruct what happened after the fact. And to me, that does not automatically make it suspicious. Actually, I think the more honest point is quite the opposite. It sounds messy because real perception is messy, especially in a house where people are asleep, half asleep, scared, confused, possibly trying to explain things to themselves in real time, and then later trying to put those fragments into order. But the problem is what happens later, because messy perception can eventually become a clean, official sequence. And we've seen it happen time and time again. A witness may remember fragments, impressions, and sounds. An affidavit turns those fragments into sequence. Dylan describes normalcy first: people coming home, parties, roommates, everyone going to bed. Murphy, the dog, Kaylee's dog. No obvious issues earlier in the night. And that normalcy matters because normalcy shapes interpretation. If the house is usually noisy, if people are coming and going, if the baseline assumption is nothing truly dangerous happens here, then strange sounds may not register as danger right away. They may register as annoying, weird, drunken, random, but not necessarily life-threatening. And this loops right back to the safe town frame from chapter 1. Dylan reportedly says nothing weird really happens in Moscow. That may sound like a small comment, but I don't think it is. Because if nothing weird happens here is the lens, then danger may not be the first interpretation of strange sounds at all. It begins. She hears Kaylee and Murphy. She hears barking. She hears Kaylee say, "There is someone here." She thinks Kaylee sounds scared. She opens and closes her door. She calls out. She tries calling roommates. She hears crying. She hears a man's voice. Later, she sees a figure. And this is not a clean timeline. It is a person trying to reconstruct sounds, impressions, fear, and partial observations. If this statement is accurate as transcribed, Dylan's earliest formal account appears to include Kaylee recognizing, or at least reacting to, someone being there. That does not tell us who the person was. It does not tell us exactly what Kaylee saw or heard. But it does complicate any version of the story that treats the victims as completely unaware throughout the entire sequence. Then there is Dylan's own fear response. Her statement does not describe someone calmly watching events unfold. It describes someone opening and closing a door, calling out, trying phones, locking the door, and trying to make sense of sounds. This too matters and is very, very important. Not because Dylan needs to be attacked, but because her statement sounds like fear, confusion, and reconstruction, and not a neat, finished timeline. And the suspect description has that same uncertainty. Approximate height, athletic build, black clothing, a mask, white male. No clear memory of eyebrows or eyes. Something near the stomach or belt line that she thought maybe could have been a gun or some kind of an object. She was tired. She was unsure. And that does not make the statement worthless. And of course, it makes it human. But it also should make us cautious about treating later clean summaries as if they came from clean perception in the moment. This is where the timeline starts to matter, because Dylan is not giving a stopwatch account. She reportedly estimates about 10 or 20 minutes between hearing "there is someone here" and seeing the suspect. She says she was in and out of it. She says she did not fully remember the incident. This is not a precise timeline. That is a witness trying to reconstruct a terrifying and confusing series of events. And then there is Bethany, the other surviving roommate. Bethany reportedly heard something like a loud boom, while Dylan did not hear it. Dylan heard voices and movement that Bethany may not have interpreted the same way. So the soundscape inside this house was not simple. Different people, different floors, different rooms, different states of sleep, fear, shock, intoxication, confusion, or delayed understanding. All of that affects what is heard, and all of that affects how it is interpreted later. And then, of course, there is the delayed 911 call. This is still one of the hardest parts of the public narrative for people to understand, including myself. But I think the responsible way to analyze it is not to turn Dylan or Bethany into villains necessarily. It is to ask what the official narrative does with the delay. How does it explain it? How does it compress it? What does it leave unresolved? Because Dylan's first formal statement reads less like a finished timeline and more like a collection of sensory fragments. Voices, barking, fear, doors opening and closing, calls unanswered, an uncertain figure, an uncertain object, an uncertain span of time. And again, the issue is not that the account is messy, because real accounts are messy. The issue is whether the later narrative preserves that uncertainty or smooths it into something cleaner than the original statement supports. This is where memory becomes timeline, and timeline becomes story. This next section is where Chapter 3 shifts again. Now we're not just talking about what evidence existed. We're talking about where it was found. And Whitcomb starts with a basic point that matters a lot in this case. Crime scenes are dynamic. They do not stay frozen. The moment investigators enter, photograph, document, move, seize, and process evidence, the scene begins to change. That does not automatically mean anyone did anything wrong. It just means reconstruction depends on records, photos, reports, lab results, body cam, expert analysis as well. And when those records do not line up cleanly, the story can start to wobble. In a complex scene, the story changes depending on which record you compare. Photo, lab results, officer notes, expert analysis, and body cam. Whitcomb compares Talbot's report with Sutton's analysis and starts identifying a problem on the second floor. Talbot describes red liquid on and around the beer pong table area, the half wall, and the common areas. But Whitcomb says the photograph shows something much more subtle. Faint stains, diluted stains, possible wiped areas. Not necessarily the obvious drops and runs of the report language might make you picture. So again, we're seeing a familiar pattern. Report language can sound more certain than the image layer. And then we get to stain 26. Sutton reportedly described this as diluted cast-off with associated flow stains. It tested presumptively positive for blood, and the DNA profile included Kaylee as a major component, with Maddie as a possible minor contributor. But according to Sutton, there was no physical evidence indicating Kaylee or Maddie were in that location after sustaining bloodletting injuries. So the issue is not that Kaylee or Maddie were physically in the second floor living room. The issue is that their blood may have been carried there. which is very interesting considering the entrance and exit supposedly were the sliding glass doors on the second floor. And that creates the route problem. If blood from the third floor appears in second floor common areas, the timeline has to explain that. So, who carried it? When? Along what path? And does that path fit the official narrative sequence? Whitcomb appears to be arguing that this blood evidence may indicate movement through the second floor common areas after the third floor attack. That does not automatically prove multiple offenders, but it does raise a route problem. Whose movement explains the blood? And does that movement fit the story? The problem gets even sharper with Ethan Chapin's blood. Whitcomb says documents identify Ethan's blood on the knee wall near the stairs, while Sutton's analysis suggests Ethan did not leave the room where he was attacked. So, if Ethan did not go to the stairway, then something or someone transferred his blood there. So that does not automatically tell us who did it, but it does make the clean path harder to maintain. Then comes the white claw box. And I know, that sounds like such a random object to focus on. But in scene reconstruction, random objects can become timeline markers. If diluted stains were underneath the box, then at some point the box was positioned over those stains. So the question becomes, when? Was the box there before documentation? Was it moved during scene processing? Was it placed there after the blood had already been transferred? That is not about jumping to a conclusion. It is about recognizing that the object creates a before and after problem. Investigators do move objects during crime scene processing. They have to. You can't fully process a scene without eventually lifting things, shifting things, collecting things, and photographing items from different angles. So the issue is not simply a box moved. The issue is whether the documentation clearly tells us when it moved, who moved it, and whether the stains were already underneath it before police began processing the scene. Because if those stains were underneath the box before investigators moved anything, then the box becomes part of the event sequence. But if investigators move the box during the processing, then the question becomes whether the photo record clearly preserves that before and after. Either way, the sequence matters. And this is where my brain stops and says, wait a minute. Are we looking at the scene as it was found? Or are we looking at the scene after people had already started moving things? Because that ties right back to the larger pattern. The scene changes. The record becomes the scene. And if the record does not preserve the sequence clearly, the story built from it gets shaped. Then there is stain E. And stain E may be one of the clearest examples of the investigative gap. It tested presumptively positive for blood. Sutton described it as diluted spatter traveling from the living room area toward the stairwell opening. And then, according to Whitcomb, it was not tested further. Now, a presumptive blood test is not the same thing as a full DNA conclusion, of course. But that is exactly why the lack of further testing matters. If this stain sits in a key location and may speak to movement toward the stairwell, why wasn't it developed further? Because the deeper issue here is not one stain. It is the movement pattern those stains may imply. Blood appears in places where the victims themselves apparently did not go. Objects may have been placed over stains. Some stains appear diluted or wiped. And at least one key stain was apparently not developed further. None of that proves an alternate theory by itself, but it does challenge the clean route the public was given. And this is where the official story starts to feel too still for the evidence. The narrative gives us a route, but the scene may be showing movement. So stepping back, I don't think chapter 3 is just saying there was a lot of evidence. That would be the surface level takeaway. Of course, what this chapter is really showing us is how evidence becomes story. Because first, the evidence comes in as a flood. Then the physical evidence seen becomes a digital file. Then an expert enters the case after the theory already exists. Then the house layout becomes the logic of the crime. Then the third floor scene refuses to stay still. Then Dylan's first formal account shows uncertainty, fear, approximation, and sensory fragments. Then the second floor stains raise a route problem. So, by the time you step back and look at all of that together, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. The public-facing story is much cleaner than the evidence universe behind it. But that does not automatically mean the public story is false. But it does mean the public story was selected. It was organized, narrowed, and eventually it was formalized through the plea. And because there was no trial, that selection was never fully tested in open court. That is why this chapter matters, because in a trial, the defense could challenge the state's reconstruction. Experts could be questioned. Witnesses could be cross-examined. Reports could be compared to photographs. Stains could be explained, challenged, or contextualized. The route through the house could be tested. The gap between a report and a photograph could be explored. But in a plea, the cleanest anchors can be enough. The sheath, the car, the phone, the admission. Legally, that may satisfy the process, but narratively, it leaves a lot outside the frame. And that, to me, is the real issue Chapter 3 is raising. Not simply, was there evidence? We know there was. The better question is, which evidence became the story? And which evidence stayed buried inside the larger file? So the pattern I see in Chapter 3 is not simply there was more evidence. It's bigger than that. There was an enormous amount of evidence, but only certain pieces became the public story. There was a physical crime scene, but by the time the defense expert examined it, the scene had already become a record. There was a witness account, but the earliest formal version was much messier than the clean timeline most people remember. There were stains, objects, and possible transfer patterns that may complicate the route through the house. And there were discovery questions that raise a much bigger issue. Was the defense given meaningful access to the evidence? Or were they technically given access while practically being buried by it? And again, none of this proves an alternate theory by itself. I want to keep that line very clear, because this case does not need reckless certainty from the other direction. But it does raise real questions about how the story was built. What got selected? What got tested? What stayed buried in the files? And what never had to be answered because the case ended in a plea. And that is why Broken Plea is such an interesting title. Because the plea may be legally valid, but the story underneath it still feels fractured. And Chapter 3 is where that fracture starts to widen. So, I want to know what you think. When evidence becomes this massive, does disclosure automatically mean fairness? Can a defense team meaningfully challenge a case if the discovery itself becomes overwhelming? And what do you make of the route problem, the stains, the object sequence questions, and the gap between the scene as found and the scene as documented? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to follow the rest of this chapter-by-chapter breakdown of Broken Plea, subscribe to Motive and Method. Because this case may be legally closed, But Chapter 3 makes one thing very, very clear. The evidence story is not as clean as the plea made it sound. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.